Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, June 26th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprim humane ingeni est, Odisse cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. The president is talking peace with the leader of North Korea and preparing to do so with Russian President Putin. But American liberals are appalled that peace might break out because the profits of America's 1% depend on U.S. government threats of war against Russia and China. Defense stocks decline sharply after the Singapore summit. So the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what M.L. King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. An international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is try to encourage our fellow citizens to become aware of the killing our government is doing around the world in our name. We're involved in great crimes and should stop. I'll begin tonight with some notes from our research director, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, who points out that war funding and drone bombing expansion going on now, get no play in mainstream media while Melania wears a jacket. He's talking about the fact that a coat, with a legend on the back of it, worn by the president's wife in regard to the border controls that the Trump administration is trying to put into place, seems to have got more comment than the actual policies of the government. While some get worked up over Melania Trump's jacket, the U.S. Senate approved a 2019 military budget hike, that is an increase in the budget, of $716 billion, which is over $80 billion in 1 year and over $160 billion in 2 years. This increase is larger than the Chinese or Russian military budgets in entirety. The mainstream media is easily distracted because they know whom they really work for, the weapons manufacturers and the war machine. So Trump's latest tweet and Melania's jacket come at just the right time. And in an article by Matt Taibbi this week, he points out that one ought not to be so quick to believe the liberal objections to human rights violations in immigration policy. Michael Hayden has been working on human rights abuses for decades. When he tweets other governments have separated families and children with a picture of Auschwitz, we should recall he's the architect of the indefinite detention policy and a former CIA and NSA director. That's not the resume of someone who cares much about human rights. Taibbi also says, we've been scooping up people from around the world in a completely extra-legal process and putting them in places like Guantanamo Bay or worse for 15 years now. And Hayden was one of the first public spokesmen to talk about how detention was too meddlesome for them, it was too much trouble, so we're just killing people instead. He actually said that out loud. So this guy posing as a human rights champion is just unbelievable. Between the black sites and the drone assassination campaign, I don't know how he, Hayden, can be credible on that front. Michael Vincent Hayden is the retired U.S. Air Force four-star general and former director of the National Security Agency, principal deputy director of National Intelligence, and director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he has been quoted on the Trump procedures this week. Taibbi points out along the way that Obama drone bombed about 10 times as many people as George W. Bush, and Trump is drone bombing 8 times as many people as Obama. So policies continue regardless of who occupies the White House. Dr. No remarks, I imagine that all figures are estimates because the U.S. government doesn't know whom they're killing. The U.S. government won't reveal what they think they know, and therefore we can only estimate the degree of our culpability in these assassinations. But then again, Trump is continuing or extending what was given to him, just like Obama did. That doesn't mean G.W. Bush, Obama, or Trump are not war criminals. They all are, and should all be awaiting trial in The Hague right now. But it does mean that we're seeing precisely the kind of horror that spans administrations and corporate political parties, which force us to reject the notion that Trump is unique or that the Democrats won't do differently should they get into office again. A half-mad Democratic congressman, calls for harassment and denial of service to the Trump administration. Would this be okay if we're done against others too? Is this the level at which we conduct politics in this country? I have mentioned here before the American mythology extending back to the American Revolutionary War, and recommended the important book by Gerald Horne, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, that points out that the founding war by the United States was in fact a war to protect slavery. The American Revolution broke out not for freedom, but for the profits of the American ruling class, which came from slavery. And the British government, because of the competition, was moving towards abolishing slavery, which would severely affect the American upper class in the 1770s. Instead, they separated from the government of Britain. That was the source of the American Revolutionary War, and we've built that into a mythology of liberation, a mythology of liberty, and if you want to counter it, the best thing to see is Gerald Horne's recent book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Book's a little hard to come by, and we'll post on the website some places you, in fact, can download it. There are a number of other good videos and comments this week that our research director has found for us. Those too will be put on the website for Aware on the Air. I also want to recommend the website of our friends at Counterpunch. The remarkable article that led on Counterpunch this week by the editor, Jeffrey Sinclair, Intolerable Opinions in an Intolerant Time, talks about something that seems pretty far removed from where we are in America right now, talks about the career of John Lilburn in the 17th century England. But the problem of government oppression and the resistance to it is illustrated by John Lilburn, the leader of the Levelers in 17th century England, and the historical reflection is particularly striking. I recommend it very highly. Put that link too on the website for Aware on the Air. The U.S. has conducted 550 drone strikes in Libya since 2011, more than in Somalia, Yemen, or Pakistan, all the places where we're also carrying on war. Libya is the chief target for drone warfare since 2011, and the U.S. still doesn't do proper accounting of its own aggression. Tracking drone strikes can be confusing, so much so that even the U.S. military has difficulty accurately tallying Since last fall, the Trump administration has carried out 18 airstrikes in Libya, according to official U.S. Africa Command press releases and confirmed media reports, but only 11, according to an AFRICOM, that is the American Military Command for Africa, spokesperson. Before a congressional committee in March, even AFRICOM's own chief, General Douglas Waldhauser, provided an incorrect count of airstrikes in Libya in 2016. Changes in how strikes are defined and counted, a refusal to provide information on the aircraft used and where they originate from, and new Trump administration policies limiting disclosures of attacks have made already opaque operations even more secretive and difficult to track. How many Americans know that their government is busily killing people in Libya today? Some may know about the fact that the previous administration presided over the destruction of one of the most progressive governments in Africa, as Hillary Clinton cackled, "We came, we saw, he died," referring to the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, by Hillary's agents. He was sodomized with a bayonet, and it was the American policy that made that possible. Moving to North Korea, we might point out that just when you thought the pending North Korea decolonization, we call it denuclearization in mainstream media, is somehow too much peace, as liberals like Rachel Maddow seem to be concerned about, don't worry, President Trump wants the U.S. to dominate space with a new Space Force branch of the military. No doubt the weapons contractors agree, no known threats to the U.S. in space, but this really represents, in spite of what you've seen on television and movies, but this represents a new way to write billions or even trillions of dollars to war contractors in exchange for doing nothing. Well, doing nothing in war is a good thing for the administration to do, but to have to pay off the defense industry in order to do that seems a bit much. Finally, America continues to conduct wars around the world with properly subservient clients like the Australians. There was a picture this week of the Australian military in Afghanistan. You didn't know the Australian military was Afghanistan? Yeah, we got them to go there to kill people that we want killed in Afghanistan. The Australian military in Afghanistan was pictured flying a Nazi flag in Afghanistan. A joke, I'm sure. But nevertheless, that's exactly what U.S. allies, as we say, clients, are in fact doing. You're watching Aware on the Air, where our task is to try to talk about the war news that you don't hear in mainstream media and encourage our fellow citizens to criticize the war policy. And that's a sanitized phrase for killing people around the world, the war policy of the United States. There has been some war news that you may actually have heard something about in spite of the limitations, to put no finer point on it, placed on such news by mainstream media. In the short space of 5 days last week, June 8th to the 12th, President Trump took 3 steps that upended the old post-World War II global order and moved us a few steps towards a more peaceful world. This is quite remarkable given the wars that the U.S. continues to carry on. 2 of those steps are undeniable. The third step is perhaps not so obvious. The first step was the Singapore summit between Trump and President Kim of North Korea. The Singapore summit comes first because it rocked the world. In this bold and unprecedented meeting, President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the real name of North Korea, started down a path to détente leading to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, an intractable problem, or so the pundits informed us. But as Melania warned us, with a bemused smile some time back, Donald always shakes things up. Yeah, perhaps. The historic meeting produced more than words. Concrete steps were taken. The DPRK, North Korea, went first, terminating the testing of nuclear warheads, IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, and ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and even closing its nuclear test site, all done before the summit. Leading up to the summit, Trump cut back on the extent of annual joint South Korea-U.S. military exercises and continued to cancel them afterwards. These have been roiling the East Pacific since the 1970s, frightening the North Koreans since these war games could abruptly turn into a real invasion, as in the Korean War. At summit's conclusion, Trump went further and terminated those exercises altogether, labeling them provocative, as the North Koreans have long described them, and expensive, costs always being a big item in the Trumpian mind. These exercises were also costly for the DPRK, since they come at a time of year when agricultural labor is needed and hundreds of thousands of men must be diverted from the fields to join the armed forces in case the war games turn into a real invasion. This hurts the agricultural output of the DPRK, and one suspects it was designed by the U.S. to do so. It's no exaggeration to say that the Singapore summit is the biggest step towards peace on the Korean peninsula since President Dwight Eisenhower lived up to his 1952 campaign promise to go to Korea and end Truman's deeply unpopular war, which had claimed millions of Korean lives, 1 million Chinese lives, and tens of thousands of American ones. Ike ended that genocidal war, which had slaughtered 20% of the population of North Korea, primarily due to bombing and chemical weapons. An armistice was negotiated quickly, and so the killing stopped, but a formal treaty of peace proved politically impossible. Ike, the peacemaker, was criticized by the media for being inarticulate and stupid, and for spending too much time on the golf course. And he had a mistress. Does that sound familiar? But he brought peace. Quite rightly, the world greeted the Kim-Trump breakthrough with jubilation. Save for the U.S. elite and its press, including the interventionist Democratic Party leadership, all of which were quite glum or downright enraged. The admirable and effective President Moon of the Republic of Korea, ROK, that is South Korea, who himself was a key figure in making the summit possible, gave Trump much credit, and the South Korean people gave Moon's party overwhelming victories in the municipal elections on the day after the summit, putting the very political existence of the hawkish leadership of the rival party in question. There was great celebration in North Korea, and even Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe hailed the agreement since it removed a perceived threat to Japan. Needless to say, China and Russia, who have long pushed for denuclearization of the peninsula, were very pleased. The cessation of U.S. war games in exchange for ending DPRK testing of nukes and rockets was just the sort of first step they had advocated for some time. And the majority, 71% of the American people, approved of the summit. The Monmouth poll, taken just after the summit, and before the media had time to spin its demented take on events, reported, quote, "Most Americans, 71%, say that the recent meeting between Trump and Kim was a good idea, including 93% of Republicans, 74% of independents, and 49% of Democrats. Only 20% say it was a bad idea. This positive feeling is somewhat higher than in late April, when 63% said the prospect of having such a meeting was a good idea." Close quote. Would it not be correct to say that the Singapore summit is a move toward a world of peace by Trump and Kim? If so, should not all peace-loving forces support and praise it as a way to protect it from attacks of domestic hawks and to encourage similar steps in foreign policy? Have we done so? This is not an academic question. The opposition to this, and the policies listed further on, is large and building, as can be seen from the reaction of the press. When Jimmy Carter tried to reach an accommodation with North Korea and remove U.S. troops and 700 nuclear weapons from South Korea, he was ultimately stopped by the forces that we would now call deep state. That is the intelligence community, as we call it, and the neocons in the Congress and the press. And similar forces are already organizing to stop Trump's peace moves. If the peace movement in this country does not now do all in its power to back these moves by the Trump administration and initiatives we'll talk about in a minute, then we will bear part of the blame if those initiatives fail. What side is the peace movement on here? The answer is unclear with the Trump derangement syndrome affecting so much of the media, but we should examine the question without reference to the political picture that the media, mainstream media, has produced of Donald Trump. We should pay attention to what the U.S. government is actually doing and what the president seems to be trying to do in regard to both the North Korean summit and some other initiatives we'll talk about in a minute. You're watching Aware on the Air, where our task is to try to talk about the war news that you don't hear on mainstream media and encourage Americans to pay attention to what its government is actually doing, the war making around the world, and the efforts to stop it, some of which, surprisingly enough, come from the White House. Let's turn to achievement number 2 of the Trump administration in those 5 days in early June. It came leading up to the G7 meeting in Charlevoix, Quebec. Trump announced beforehand that Russia should be invited back into the G7, the collection of the 7 leading economic countries of the world, a move opposed by all the other members except for Italy's new populist government, which supported it. The U.S. press went berserk, of course, with many declaring, as they do many times daily, that Trump's strings were being pulled by, who else? Vladimir Putin, that Trump was a Manchurian candidate for the Russian president. This is, of course, nonsense, but it shows the madness that the War Party, which controls the American press and the Democratic Party, has in our society. Putin himself, President Putin of Russia, responded to the disagreement at the G7 in this fashion. Quote, he said, "As for Russia's return to the 7 or the 8, G7, G8, we have not left it. Our colleagues once refused to come to Russia due to well-known reasons, American opposition. Please, we'll be happy to see everyone in Moscow." Close quote. Putin made that statement at a press conference in Qingdao, China, at the conclusion of the meeting of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with its present 8 member states, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, with Iran currently an observer, backed by China, to become a full member. Putin went farther in his press conference, as reported by foreign media. The SCO gathering concluded just shortly after the G7 summit, and Russia enjoys the format of the now 8-member organization after India and Pakistan join. Putin believes the SCO trumps the G7 in certain aspects. I'm not sure the pun is intended, but the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization of these economically powerful states, is more important than the economic association of the G7. For example, the member states have already overtaken the G7 in purchasing power parity, the Russian leader said, citing IMF data. So the American attempt to organize economically powerful states is being severely challenged by the Russian and Chinese attempt to do so in the SCO as opposed to the G7. Quote, "If we calculate per capita, the 7 countries are wealthier, but the size of the SCO economies combined is larger. And the population is, of course, much bigger, half of the planet. Putin told reporters. That is, the combined gross GDPs of the SCO8, that is the Chinese-Russian Association, are larger than the combined economies of the G7, the American Association, by the metric used by the IMF and World Bank and the CIA. It is noteworthy that Russia's GDP is about equal to Germany's, and not the basket case that it's made out to be in the Western press. In fact, the G7 has only 3 of the world's 7 largest economies, the same number as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, 8. The G7 are really nothing more than the ex-colonial and now neo-colonial countries whose time may be running out with the rise of the economies of the once colonized nations of East and South Asia. In calling for Russia's readmission to the G7, Trump was turning his back on the old Cold War alliances and looking to the economic realities of the 21st century, exemplified by the SCO. He was opting to create an atmosphere of dialogue which would include Russia. As he later said, the G7 spends 25% of its time discussing Russia, so why not have Russia present and try to work out problems together? Trump's appeal to readmit Russia to the G7 is simply a repeat of his call to, quote, get along with Russia, close quote, a promise made in his campaign of 2016. Is that not a good idea? Is the recognition of new realities not part of creating a peaceful world? Would it not be correct to say that this move of Trump's is a move toward a world of peace? If so, should not all peace-loving forces support and praise it as a way to protect it from attacks of domestic hawks and to encourage similar steps in foreign policy? Have we done so? Again, this is not an academic question because the outcome depends in part on our support or lack thereof. That's the reason we don't hear anything about it in mainstream media. The fear is that the U.S. populace would recognize that it's a good idea. The third move in Trump's weekend trifecta is not so much an action of his in and of itself, but the revelation of a mindset behind that action. Trump has set in motion the imposition of tariffs on countries that he views as unfair in trade with the U.S. The point is not to argue whether such tariffs are good or bad, or even whether the U.S. has been treated unfairly. One might think, however, that the need to impose them is the sign of a trading power in its infancy, which needs to protect its key enterprises, or of one in decline, which can no longer prevail by virtue of the quality of what it produces. But that's not of significance for this discussion. If you want to talk about trade policies that has existed since the beginning of the United States, when the U.S., of course, had a vast tariff wall around its infant industries, then you might want to talk that way. But that has little to do with the current situation. What is unusual is that Trump did not limit his economic attacks to an official adversary like China. No, he was also directing them at our allies, from NATO all the way to Japan on the other side of the world. In so doing, he shows that commerce is more important to him than alliances that facilitate military actions aimed at domination and hegemony. It might fairly be said that Trump is putting mercantilism over imperialism, if by mercantilism we mean economic nationalism. Most of those at the G7 meeting who were aghast at the tariffs are NATO allies. This action taken without regard to the alliance, NATO, reminds us of Trump's assertion during the campaign of 2016 that, quote, NATO is obsolete, close quote. It's obviously true, but what that means in terms of the international economy still needs to be spelled out. Trump's stance was criticized by Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau on this very basis, saying, quote, Canadians did not take it lightly the United States has moved forward with significant tariffs on our steel and aluminum industry. For Canadians who stood shoulder to shoulder with American soldiers in far-off lands and conflicts from the First World War onward, it's kind of insulting, close quote. In fighting in the useless and criminal World War I, is fighting in the useless and criminal World War I something to be proud of? Let's pass over the many other murderous conflicts that have engaged the U.S. and the G7 in the last 25 years, let alone the past 70-plus years. Trudeau encompasses all this criminal behavior in the single word, onward. The alliances that have made this possible are indeed obsolete, in fact, retrograde and dangerous. Trudeau is simply saying the G7 has been willing allies in the imperial crimes of the U.S., so they expect due economic consideration in return. Trump is saying no more. Now, the business of America is business first and foremost. This does not mean that economic nationalism is the answer to the world's problems. But Trump's action does represent a move away from the entangling alliances that have been employed to further the hegemonistic policies of the U.S. Would it not be correct to say that favoring competition in trade over cultivating alliances through military hegemony is a positive development? Should not all peace-loving forces praise the move away from our alliances, away from NATO, which has been the agent of so many criminal wars in the last quarter centuries? At this point in the conventional treatment of matters Trumpian, it's compulsory to launch into some psychobabble about the man, with cries of indignation about his narcissism or vulgarity or some other imagined personality disorder. This one is not a mind reader, nor do I have much faith in the science of psychology, since anti-Trump disclaimers are more often than not simply inoculation to prevent writers from the wrath of the legions of Trump haters and respectables. Such disclaimers also represent a cheesy substitution of pop psych for political analysis. The beginnings of Trump foreign policy has not taken us from a quarter-century drive towards U.S. unipolar hegemony, which began with the Clintons, to a nirvana of peace in the space of 18 months. Since the U.S. empire is the last of the 500 years of European empires, successor to them all, it would be absurd to even expect such an outcome. Likewise, it would be easy to Google all the things that are wrong with U.S. foreign policy and even growing worse. We try to do a little of that here. But one of the current problems, U.S. policy towards Iran, looms large and deserves special mention. Because Iran has support from Russia, and because it lies so close to Russia, conflict with Iran is likely to destroy Trump's desire for détente with Russia, and could therefore drag the U.S. into military conflict with a great nuclear power, even a world war. Such a thing would be catastrophic for humanity. So it's a very big deal. Fundamentally, Trump's position on Iran is dictated by Israel, which maintains its stranglehold on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa. By necessity, given Israel's power in U.S. politics, and by his conviction as well, Trump's brain is Israeli-occupied territory. The same malign influence contributes to the criminal U.S. support of the Saudi atrocities in Yemen. Perhaps discussions with Putin can help Trump on this matter. But right now, Israel poses one of the great obstacles to a new and enlightened foreign policy and a key area for all of humanity. Finally, let's return again to the Singapore summit. Please immerse yourself in the jubilation it generated worldwide. It jumps out of the screen in Gangnam style. Be sure the sound is on when you're listening to it. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We have been talking about the things that are not mentioned in mainstream media, and we need to conclude because our time is running out. Aware on the Air is presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, recorded on June 26th in the 26th week of 2018, another week in which the world concedes the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. We'll conclude tonight with a video selected by Dr. No, Ralph Nader interviewed by Chris Hedges. They cover corporate control, law school fecklessness, National Security Advisor John Bolton's ignorant recklessness, media organization, and more. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, will be in Champaign next Saturday to discuss Inside Iran, the real history and politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. U.S. relations with Iran have been fraught for decades, but under the Trump administration, tensions are rising to startling levels. Medea Benjamin, one of the best-known 21st century peace activists, offers the incredible history of how a probable alliance became a bitter antagonism. That's Saturday, June 30th, 2018, at 1:30 p.m. at the McKinley Presbyterian Church, 5th and Daniel Street in Champaign. Ms. Benjamin will offer remarks, answer questions, and autograph books for sale. The co-sponsors include Just Foreign Policy, the Prairie Greens, and the Progressive Democrats of America. The Aware meeting this coming Sunday, 5 to 6 p.m., will be at the Hammerhead Coffee, University Avenue at Wright Street in Campustown. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the corporate coup d'etat that has seized power with consumer advocate and former presidential candidate Ralph Nader.
So we have all these myths that operate about a democratic society, and obviously a democratic society rots slowly by definition, and we have been decaying and disintegrating our democratic institutions for over 40 years now.
Forget the paralysis in Congress. Forget the idiocy of a press that covers our descent into tyranny as if it were a reality show starring our maniacal president and the idiots, porn stars, and kleptocrats that surround him. Forget the noise. The crisis we face is not embodied in the public images of the politicians that run our dysfunctional government. The crisis we face is the result of a 4-decade-long, slow-motion corporate coup d'etat that has rendered the citizen impotent, left us without any authentic democratic institutions, and allowed corporate and military power to become omnipotent. This crisis has spawned a corrupt electoral system of legalized bribery and empowered those public figures that master the skills of entertainment and artifice. And if we do not overthrow the corporate forces that have destroyed our democracy, we will continue to vomit up more monstrosities as dangerous as Donald Trump. Trump is the symptom, not the disease. Joining me to discuss the decay of our democracy is Ralph Nader, who has been fighting corporate power longer and with more integrity than perhaps any other American. Ralph, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's talk about that corporate coup d'etat, which you rang the alarm bells about 3 and 4 decades ago with Tony Coelho, the Clintons, and yet it appears in the Trump administration that we have been ratcheted up, to a whole new level.
Yeah, well, here we are in corporate occupied territory, otherwise known as Washington, D.C.
Right.
And I've seen it over the years become very sophisticated expression of the plutocracy. And so you have the plutocracy ruled by a few wealthy, developing an ever more penetrating oligarchy ruled by a few politicos, indentured to the super wealthy. And you have to give them credit. With their corporate attorneys, they have developed one of the most sophisticated controls of a formerly democratic society, and turning the very institutions, Congress, the courts, the executive branch, against the people whose power they receive under our system of delegated authority. from the sovereign people to their government. It's a brilliant achievement. Brilliant because it doesn't rest on the iron boot or smashing doors at 3 a.m.
Well, they'll do that in poor neighborhoods.
They don't have to do that in most places. What they do is simply keep the myths alive. Like we have democratic elections. We do not.
Right.
The democratic elections require that votes are supreme, not big money. They require contested candidacies, not a two-party duopoly that increasingly reflects the same commercial interests. They say we have a free press, but we do not. We have a press that's indentured to advertising revenue, and they themselves are now conglomerate corporations, right. You know, and 5 big ones control most of the circulation and viewership in the country. So we don't have that. They say we have a free judiciary, independent judiciary. But somehow on the big questions of abuses of power, like going to war without congressional declaration of war, which is a requirement under our Constitution, and we have not had a declaration of war since 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The courts have a very convenient doctrine. It's called, this is a political question, invading Iraq, and we don't deal with political questions. This is to be decided between the Congress, which abdicates its duty, and the presidency. And then when citizens say, well, we don't believe in that, we're going to go to court and go all the way to the Supreme Court to challenge this illegal war of criminal aggression against Iraq, they have another convenient doctrine. It's called, you have no standing to sue.
Yeah, right.
So all the American people have no standing to sue, dealing with a criminal war of aggression and the soldiers that go over there and all the Iraqis who have died. Well, who has standing to sue? Only one person, the Attorney General. And guess who his boss is? The President. So he's not about to sue the President. So we have all these myths that operate about a democratic society. And obviously, a democratic society rots slowly by definition. And we have been decaying and disintegrating our democratic institutions for over 40 years now.
One of the ways they do it is by judicial fiat, Citizens United,
Yes.
or, of course, denying you standing. So
Yeah.
when President Obama signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, prohibiting the military from acting as a domestic police force, I sued him in the Southern District Court of New York. We won. The Obama administration immediately appealed. It's such a blatant violation of constitutional rights. And the way that they kept it in law was denying my standing. And when Carl Mayer and Bruce Saffron filed a cert or petition to the Supreme Court, they denied standing.
See, that's the way it is. And it's a phony standard. It comes from medieval England, which says that you are thrown out of court if you don't have a specific interest to sustain the lawsuit you filed against the Crown. Well, that usually now means an economic interest, that they have to be a corporation that might lose sales, for example. It's a very disturbing situation because, as I've said in my book, Breaking Through Power, it's easier than we think. Chris, it only takes 1% or less of the people really mobilized in every congressional district. Let's say 3,000 or 4,000 people in every congressional district, which has 750,000 people on average. As long as they represent a majority opinion on something, they can control the Congress against any vested interest. I mean, we used to do it with far less than that on regulating the auto industry, getting through the Free Information Act, which is opposed by not only the bureaucrats, but almost every corporate trade association, because they didn't want government information on them available to the public. And we have to always ask, we don't need huge numbers of people. We need about 1% of the people spending 300 to 500 hours a year connecting with each other, opening full-time offices in every congressional district, and focusing on just 530 people, 35 people, men and women in the U.S. Congress. That's the branch that has the most power under our Constitution.
I want to go back to law. You're a lawyer, and you have really called out the legal profession, the deans of law schools, for being complicit in the erosion of our most fundamental democratic rights. Explain that, what happened.
Well, we have 206 law schools in the country. You would think they are the first responders to challenge the criminal injustice system, conditions in the prison, violation of civil rights, crushing consumer rights, and the government being taken over by corporations. It's not happening. It's like they're training technicians, lawyers, to serve the powerful
Well, that's what they do. You went to Harvard Law School.
Yes.
These people graduated from Harvard Law School today. Yep. Where are they going?
That's right. Mike Pompeo is Secretary of State, a total warmonger, and I might add, a bigot against Arabs and Muslims, based on his own assertions when he was a member of Congress and after that. So here's the test. In recent years, excuse me, in recent years, I have sent messages to the deans of all these law schools. Most recently, I sent them my article on lawlessness in America. That lawlessness by the rich and powerful is the norm, not obeying the law. Either they violate the law with impunity, or they make sure the law provides loopholes for them with their influence in Congress.
And let me just interject, that's why you call these corporate forces revolutionary.
Yes, of course. I mean, they are extremists to the degree. They really have no conscience, no soul. The corporate entity is an artificial being, driven maniacally by profit, and rolls over anything that's in its way, or co-ops or preempts civil society forces, for the most part. And so I would send this article that appeared in Lapham's Quarterly on lawlessness, and I said, you really have to educate your students about lawlessness. Otherwise, they're going to graduate and just tinker with the law and just work it like a plumber works pipes, without talking about where the pipes go, what's in the pipes, whether the metallurgy is safe, and so on. And I got like one response of over 200 deans. And I've done this repeatedly on all kinds of issues. They don't even respond. You go to law schools and you speak, and the law students are so clueless and fact-deprived about what's going on in this country in terms of the concentration and abuse of power, they don't show up. So we have a real crisis in the legal educational institution that breed the next generation of lawyers. And the lawyers are the architects of corporate power.
Right.
They're the architects of grinding responsible government into the ground and turning it into an accounts receivable corporate welfare crony capitalism for these big businesses, and giving these corporations immunities and privileges which we would never have as real individuals. They are artificial entities. They cannot be morally accountable like real individuals could be, unshielded by the corporate structure.
And yet they're given the rights of individuals.
Of course. They're treated, again, as
the rights of individuals, but they never have to pay the price for crime.
That's right.
The way individuals
do. Right. A judicial coup in 1886 basically determined that corporations were persons for purpose of the Constitution. Most people don't recognize that the Constitution doesn't even have the word company, corporate, or political party in it. So why are we ruled by them? You see the distortion? The only persons recognized in the Constitution are real people. Starts out with we the people, not we the corporations.
Great. When we come back, we're going to talk about another law school graduate from Yale Law School, John Bolton. Thank you. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with author, political activist, and former presidential candidate, Ralph Nader. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation with author, political activist, and former presidential candidate, Ralph Nader. So we spoke a while ago, and you warned me about John Bolton. And now we have walked away from the Iran deal. This is something you are deeply concerned about. Why?
John Bolton graduated from Yale Law School and forgot about the law. He is the most belligerent, lawless advocate in terms of reaching high official positions in the Bush administration, George W. Bush, and now in the Trump administration. He's a national security advisor. very few people like him. The Republicans so disliked him that when George W. Bush nominated him to be ambassador to the UN, they refused to confirm him. And so Mr. Bush sent him on a recess appointment for a year. When he was there, he was utterly disruptive rather than diplomatic force. When the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 2006, his boss, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, was working in the early days of the invasion for ceasefire. And he totally undermined her. He went to the home of the Israeli ambassador to the UN in New York and developed a strategy whereby the government of Israel would pressure the White House not to have a ceasefire. And so Lebanon was destroyed over the next 28 days before the war stopped. That's the kind of insubordination. That's the kind of belligerency. He has written in the Wall Street Journal that he thinks we should bomb North Korea. He thinks we should overturn the government of Iran. He thinks the Israelis should militarily annex the Palestinian West Bank. He has no sense of plan B. He has no sense of consequence. He is ignorant of any kind of consequence to his warlike advocacy. And that's who's in the White House now. And so it's not surprising that Mr. Trump has withdrawn from the Iran nuclear accord, because he has the #1 enemy of that accord next to him in the Oval Office.
One of the things about figures like Bolton, or we can go back and look at Cheney and Louis Scooter Libby and Wolfowitz, is that they carry out these actions, and do they just not think about the consequences? What is it that, I mean, a war, I spent 7 years in the Middle East, a war with Iran is not only unfeasible, but catastrophic. It would certainly ignite a Shiite uprising throughout the Middle East. 60% of the people who live in Iraq are Shia. Huge Shia population in Saudi Arabia. What drives them? I mean, what is this? What's this impetus for spreading kind of industrial death and destruction?
Well, first of all, there are such human beings who are brutish to the core and extremely confident that if worse comes to worse, we can nuke them all, no matter how many billions of people. That's their attitude, that we're the most powerful military in the world, and we're invulnerable except for some explosions here and there, which we can absorb in terms of blowback from what we're doing to those people overseas and all the civilians and families who get killed. They really have that mindset. It's the mindset of empire.
Right, but they were unlike you. Yeah. They never served in the military.
That's why I say they're brutish cowards, because most of them, the neocons, got draft deferments. Like Dick Cheney said, he got 5 draft deferments during the Vietnam War.
So did Bolton.
And Bolton. And Cheney was asked, why'd you get draft deferments? You supported the Vietnam War. And he said, because I didn't have time to go there. In other words, he wanted his friends to go there and fight and die, and kill in Vietnam. These are cowards. What's amazing is in the American mythology, people like that shouldn't be popular politically.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be electable. They shouldn't be appointable. And it's just the reverse. You had George W. Bush, who was
he went AWOL.
AWOL. He was really a draft dodger, too.
Well, worse than that. He was in the National Guard, and he just stopped showing up.
That's right.
And before he ran for president, they went down to Texas and expunged all of his records, so nobody could document.
And with the serial draft dodger Dick Cheney, he vanquished a Vietnam veteran called John Kerry in 2004. That's not supposed to happen in American political history. And that's an example of the deterioration of our political system.
I want to talk about the arms industry. You, I think, pointed me towards the work of Seymour Melman, Columbia University, talked about how the arms industry had distorted the American economy. What is the connection between a Bolton and the arms industry, and how much is the arms industry now driving foreign policy?
Well, I raised it in a column. I had, you can go to nader.org, on John Bolton. I asked the question, how could a crazy guy like Bolton can get this country into deep trouble, never mind what he does to millions of people abroad? How can he keep being given these high positions? And one main reason is that the extremes of the military-industrial complex love him because he means bigger military budgets, more contracts for Boeing, for Raytheon, for Lockheed Martin, for General Dynamics, submarine manufacturer. And so that's a big support for somebody like him. The other, of course, is the Israeli lobby, because he's more extreme than Netanyahu. So they love him being in high positions. There isn't a countervailing civic infrastructure made up of retired military, diplomatic, and national security officials who are much more prone to diplomacy and waging peace and averting wars of aggression. They're not organized. And if they were organized, if someone like George Soros would fund the Secretariat to organize them, there'd be a countervailing force because these people are patriots. They're not going to be attacked for being draft deferment people. They're extremely experienced from years in government under both Republican and Democrat. Remember, in the months going up to the drumbeat for war in Iraq in 2003, 300 or so high-level generals, admirals, heads of the National Security Council spoke out against it, including the two closest advisors to George W. Bush's father, Scowcroft and James Baker. But they weren't organized. It was a one-day, article in the New York Times or something. They didn't have a structure that would get them media and get them on Capitol Hill for public hearings. And that's what George Soros and others could have done, with hardly feeling the monetary contribution.
But if you look even at MSNBC, who are their analysts? They're retired military. Brennan, the former head of the CIA, who orchestrated this disastrous policy of arming, quote-unquote, moderate rebels in Syria. These are the people offering commentary. And what they don't tell you is that they are often sitting on the boards or directly in the employment of the war industry.
That's right. I mean, there are some retired military that are warmongers, but I'm saying they're tremendous.
Well, but I'm saying getting the message out.
Yeah, and they can't get the message out because obviously they're not going to get the message out on Fox. MSNBC is a fraud. They keep out progressive advocates and progressive military and keep out people like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, the late Howard Zinn, and others. And they justify it by saying, well, we let liberals on. Liberals are not progressive. Liberals are more into empire. They're more into corporate welfare. They're more into raising money from Wall Street. They don't connect with the mass of the people. Progressives are against that kind of plutocracy. So I have very rarely been on MSNBC, for example. Bill Grider, great writer for The Nation.
Well, he wrote the great book on the Fed.
Yes. Yeah, very rarely, if ever. So MSNBC is a fraud in a way. They're the ones who fired Phil Donahue.
What about NPR?
NPR is
well, you've been blacklisted virtually, right?
I mean, first of all, NPR does not cover controversial civic gatherings very well at all. They have good features from around the world, but they can be analyzed by who funds them. And you can see that a lot of big corporations fund them. Same with PBS. Money talks in the U.S. as in every country in the world.
It's the State Department. This is, I find, as somebody who spent 20 years overseas, really frightening, the degradation of the mechanism by which diplomacy is carried out.
Well, I have a lot of friends in the former foreign service, and they've been sidelined. They have been degraded by secretaries of state, and they've been jeopardized because when you use military force instead of diplomacy, and there are all kinds of tragic disasters with civilians overseas, they are going to endanger our civil servants, the foreign service, from doing their proper jobs. And it's just another example, the militarization of the State Department.
Yeah.
The State Department's charter had nothing to do with military. It was to deal with customs and diplomacy back over 200 years ago. Under Hillary Clinton, under Condoleezza Rice.
Well, Clinton was the architect of the whole attack on Libya.
Completely. She
as Secretary of State.
Yeah. She overrode Secretary of Defense Gates, who was opposed, and persuaded Obama that it was just going to be a few days aerial bombing.
They had a government in place with this. And you know, Bolton and all these people are talking about the Mujahideen al-Haq, which is this bizarre, I knew them because they were based in Iraq. They were essentially under the protection of Saddam Hussein. They have zero credibility or following within Iran. And yet you have Giuliani and others in the same way we saw with Chalabi holding up this phantom entity that would go into Baghdad and take over. They have a phantom entity that they think is going to take over in Tehran.
That's the same old routine. Yeah, Hillary Clinton deserves full credit for the overthrow of Libya and the incredible violence, chaos to this day, not just in Libya, but in Mali and other, and other African countries.
Yeah, well, that gets to the heart of the problem with liberals.
Well, corporate liberals.
Corporate liberals.
Remember the adjective.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. That was Ralph Nader, author, activist, and former presidential candidate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.